FEQ is a new style of event.
What's different about this event, it's not conventional really. It's not about workshops and stands and stall holders. It is that, but it's also a chance for us to have two panels.
We have a Q&A panel in the style of BBC Question Time, and then we also have networking and exhibiting opportunities.
We want to hear what the sector actually thinks about apprenticeships, so we want to give people an opportunity to actually ask questions and get answers from experts in the sector.
We wanted to get involved. We've been working with Bolt anyway on some outreach stuff with FE Spotlights and FE Insights, and it was a great chance for us to work together again.
One of our values is to give back, and we believe that hosting debates like this will generate discussion and lead to improvements in the sector.
I wanted to have an event where it was open to anybody to come and for people to be brave enough to sit on a panel and answer a question that's given to them.
All the questions come from either attendees that have sent them in ahead of time or from the floor itself at the end of each panel.
Today we have two panel sessions. One is on endpoint assessment, one is on apprenticeships, reform and funding. We wanted a broad spectrum of contributors on the panel.
From employers, from awarding bodies, from endpoint assessment organisations, from training providers, to make it a 360 panel of what represents the apprenticeship sector.
And I think we've got a fantastic mix in there.
For the panel chair, we wanted someone well respected and very knowledgeable within apprenticeships, and as the ex-chair of AALP, Stewart was an obvious choice.
He's been around for decades. He will hate me for saying that, but he knows the people, he knows the questions to ask.
An independent, incredibly knowledgeable guy, respected in the industry.
He knows what the issues are in the sector today, so he won't be afraid to ask the questions.
Well, thank you very much, and you probably guess my name's Stewart Segal, and welcome to everybody to this inaugural event. The organisers, Apprenticeship for England, Bolt and Ingredient Films, wanted this to be a free-to-attend event for everybody involved in the FE sector. So it's great to see so many of you here today, and you've had a good opportunity to network and meet people. You, the audience, have set the agenda today by sending in a wide range of questions. The organisers have selected those down to make sure that the discussions are focused on the issues that you wanted to talk about. But at the end, we'll also try and open up the discussion for people to make a comment or ask another question that hasn't been covered. The first topic is endpoint assessments, which is a new element for apprenticeships and was always one of the cornerstones of the reforms. So it's important that we make this work and find a new model that works for apprentices and employers. So there's a whole range of questions that have been asked, and we've boiled that down to 5 or 6 key ones, and as I say, we'll have a bit of time at the end to ask other questions if we haven't covered them. But we've got a great panel today, very experienced in the apprenticeship sector and certainly in endpoint assessment. So firstly, Tom Bewick, who is the Chief Executive of the Federation of Awarding Bodies, representing a number of different awarding organisations. Charlotte Bosworth, from the CEO of Innovate Awarding, who represents one of the operational organisations delivering the endpoint assessment. And we've got an employer perspective from Sharon Blyfield from Coca-Cola. We've also got a couple of training providers who again have a perspective about endpoint assessment and making that work. That's Eric Imune, founder and director of Diva Apprenticeships, and Richard Marsh, the Apprenticeship Partnership Director at Kaplan. Our first question comes from Lisa Jenkins from Skills First.
Hi, does the panel think we should have endpoint assessment? Is it needed or should it be replaced with something else?
It's obviously a very broad question and covers a lot of ground, so perhaps, Tom, I could ask you to kick off.
Thanks, Stuart. I always like to give a direct answer to a direct question. So the short answer from me is absolutely yes, we should keep endpoint assessment, and frankly, it horrifies me, the idea of yet another major reform around apprenticeships. When the last part of that question there, should we replace it with something else? I think there are people in this room who've been through probably too many replacements over the years, including myself, around skills policy. But I think it goes back to actually one of the metaphors that was used in the review that kicked off these reforms back in 2013. Some of you may remember it was the driving test metaphor. So that the notion that we wouldn't accept people learning to drive without taking an independent exam at the end of it. And actually, it's a really good metaphor, because if you think about it, the driving schools and the driving instructors are your training providers and colleges that actually deliver the training. And there's a huge array of choice and diversity out there as to who does the training. And likewise then, when you are ready to go for your test, and some of us here probably passed first time, and some of us probably took a few more times than that, but the point is there was that end point when you or your instructor decided you were ready to go, and you booked in at the examination centre and you went for that test. And that gives then the public confidence and other fellow drivers and pedestrians that we've reached a standard of driving. I think there's a whole different debate about whether or not we always have that standard of driving on our roads, but that's the whole point, I think, of endpoint assessment. It's to give the employer, the individual apprentice, but also society as a whole, confidence that when somebody goes through that endpoint assessment, they are absolutely proficient and competent in what they do. And it is, as Stewart was saying, a cornerstone of the reforms, and I believe we've really got to make it work.
Sharon, I wonder if you could give an employer perspective to that?
Absolutely. So for us at Coca-Cola, we are only just about to go through our first endpoint assessment. So to change it now, I think would be a bit of a challenge for us, in all honesty. I was with some operations directors a couple of weeks ago, and we were trying to explain the driving test to them, and they were like, this is fantastic, we really, really love it. Can we use the assessment for some people who aren't going through an apprenticeship? Because if that's supposed to be the standard and the benchmark, surely that's what we should be benchmarking our other employees against. So if we were then to come along now and go, really sorry, that thing we've only just gone through, we're now going to change it, I think the business would be in uproar, in all honesty, because we don't know what we don't know at the moment, so let's go with what's there.
Sure.
So I'm an endpoint assessment organisation, and we're at a stage where we've had 400 endpoint assessments now taken place, which seems not many, but actually it's quite a few when we look at where we are overall. So I think the independent side, if we want parity, then endpoint assessment is a good thing, but there are some things that would need to be changed if we are going to all make this a success. So I've got my 4 C's, sorry, but I'm just hoping that I'll get a bit of momentum with these 4 C's. So the first is around clarity. There's actually a number of parts of the endpoint assessment where people aren't sure who's responsible for what. We take invigilation, we take venues, and oh gosh, there's a whole list of examples. And I think actually that clarity of who's responsible for what is something that we need to fight for the apprentice, employer, provider, and for endpoint assessment organisations. I think consistency is another one. I'm speaking to employers where in some situations I'm able to say that there are resits that can take place. In other situations, I'm saying actually you can't have resits there. That's a really difficult message to take out. So we do actually need some consistency when we're looking at those areas. I think capacity is actually been underestimated. We've got lots of people who have been assessors previously who are training now to become endpoint assessors, but we're in a new world. I'm going to take some of my retail employers. There isn't necessarily the technology within stores. Actually, the thought that multiple choice questions would all be done online, that's not necessarily always possible. There's some places that aren't necessarily equipped for those endpoint assessments to take place. That's all different challenges that endpoint assessors and also employers are having to face. So that additional burden on employers, I think, hasn't yet been fully understood. And costings. We know there's been a number of cuts that have come out in relation to the delivery of apprenticeships. That also impacts if you take the 20% rule on the cost of assessment, but is anybody actually turned around and said, what is the true cost of this delivery? And actually, what is the true cost of the assessment without actually just applying a blanket rule?
Do you find the employers are happy with the principle of EPA?
I think there's been a lot of employers who have been behind apprenticeships for a long period of time, and even with the levy coming in, they were just actually, this is another opportunity for our businesses. That's a difficult thing now we're actually in it. They've said I can use them as an example, so I will. So BT is one of our clients who have always supported apprenticeships. Actually now they're feeling that pressure of more ownership on team leaders to actually get coverage when other endpoint assessment is taking place, be involved in the scheduling. On average, our assessors are having to make around 7 phone calls to get through to the right person within that employer. So it's more of a challenge actually for the employers, and is that additional burden yet fully understood? And I'm sure that's something you're yet to find out and discover.
No, absolutely. So we've got our training provider coming in because they said, oh, it's fine, it'll be okay. I'm like, we've never been through one, so how do I know it's going to be okay? Yeah. And that's just the start of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Richard, perhaps a perspective from a provider.
Yeah, sure. So we've had 25 learners go through endpoint assessment, 23 of whom have been successful. So we've got a small experience, and yeah, it's worked. You know, it's physically worked. We've got 250 though between now and Christmas, and 1,000 next year. So that'll be the real test. You know, will it work? Will it work at volume? And I think we can already see that it will act as a restriction on the take-up of apprenticeships, because it makes us more cautious around starting learners if we're not sure the capacity is there. And I think the principle and the policy can be seen to work. I think they were looking for 2 things in the Richard review that Tom talks about. One is to make apprenticeships more definite, you know, when you've passed or failed. Because apprentices never used to fail. Apprenticeships on frameworks and MVQs don't fail. They give up, they change job, they have a baby, they do something different. They don't fail, you know, and they just kind of drop off or stay with it. With standards, with Endpoint, there'll be a pass or fail, so it'll be a bit more definitive. And the other thing, really, that they wanted to introduce was a bit more rigor, you know, and have a higher bar. And I think that's probably there too. Where I think it's difficult is the practicalities. So there isn't the capacity to do 300,000 endpoint assessments a year. So if that's the new norm of apprenticeship volumes in England, you know, there isn't the capacity. There won't be the capacity for that. So there has to be some delegation of roles to providers, intermediaries or others to do some of the legwork. Otherwise it will be a constraint on volumes. And I think governments have recognised that. If you look at universities, they've been allowed to do their own endpoint assessments, haven't they, through the integrated model? And I think that others will have to be allowed to do their own endpoint assessment too. Otherwise, we'll run out and it'll become a blocker to
I think that's a very valid point. Maybe something we'll come back to. Eric, did you want to just...
Picking up on that point, I think it was in an article that I read that you wrote, actually, Tom, where you quoted, I can't remember the name of the person, but basically saying that training providers shouldn't be marking their own homework. So I think having...
To Jerry,
yes,
the IFA.
So I think, and we are an endpoint assessment organisation as well, and we did our first cohort last year for the broadcast production assistant. And I think I'm in agreement that there should be an endpoint assessment process. I think there is a lot of work to be done to stabilise it, but it is a fairly new process for many providers. I know Trailblazers were involved earlier, but for the vast majority of us, we didn't start delivering standards till maybe last year when the levy kicked in. So there will be a lot of teething problems, but I think in principle, it is important. But I think the relationship between the endpoint assessment organisation and the provider needs to be established very, very early on. And I personally don't think a standard should be published as ready to be delivered unless there is an endpoint assessment organisation in place and they've been able to develop their assessment materials, their price and policy, and then you can say we're good to go.
Of course, quite a number of those themes get picked up, certainly in terms of not the split of duties between training providers and assessment organisations, but clearly they need to work very closely together. And there's a lot of the assessment process that is administration and contacts, and we've just got to find the best way of doing that on behalf of the employers and the apprentices. If apprentices are ready for their assessment, but it doesn't get done because for whatever reason it doesn't get organised, we need to be conscious of that. The second question comes from David Boyer from Capel Manor College.
So this was cued by the last comments that you made, actually, so it chimes with this. What plans are in place, if any, to ensure that EPA is available for every apprentice who's currently on a programme?
So we do know, you read articles in the press about what percentage of standards where there isn't an EPA organisation in place, and even where there is, are they ready to deliver it? So I think it's a good question, which perhaps I could ask Tom to kick off.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one from the point of view of, who do you believe? Do you believe FE Week, that regular articles around the sense that actually we really don't have enough EPA in the market, and that we have already entered the situation where individual apprentices are on programme, but as yet no EPAO is identified, and that's a very, very real concern if that's happened. But at the same time, as part of the sort of IFA's myth-busting exercise, and obviously I'm not here to speak on behalf of the IFA, but one has listened to some of their presentations, and they argue that I think it's around 0.2% of the current stock of apprentices is on programme without an identified endpoint assessment organisation. And then, of course, the ALP itself has published research showing that around about a third of EPAOs on the register have never delivered any kind of sort of assessment. I think probably the honest answer is, this is a nascent market. It's finding its feet in many different ways. And I mean, Charlotte talked very eloquently about the sorts of processes that Innovate are putting in place. And I had the privilege of sitting around the table with her team in Bristol and going through some of these challenges. And every single EPAO, depending on what standard or standards that they're delivering, will be trying to sort of work its way through, because the Richard Review may have come up with a sort of blueprint for how we should move to an endpoint assessment model. And by the way, it's just worth highlighting for the audience, Stuart, there's only one other example in the world of this EPA model, and it's Canada's apprenticeship system, because even the famed German Swiss, Austrian models, they're based on more ongoing assessment of those apprentices, and ultimately employers themselves actually decide whether or not you've reached your required apprenticeship standards. So, in that sense, we are an innovator as a country in terms of what we're trying to do. But I think it's something that, will have to be returned to on a regular basis about whether or not these reforms really are being implemented in the most coherent, most effective way. I mean, one of the concerns for my members, obviously I represent over 150 odd awarding organisations, many of whom, around 48, are on the register delivering endpoint assessment, because obviously their heritage is in really good quality assessment design and curriculum. One of the things I think our members feel quite aggrieved by around the reforms is that, there was this ideological decision taken that not to attach a qualification, a portable qualification, to the competency-based standards. And it's interesting that international experts like Hilary Steedman, who's looked at TVET systems around the world, is actually saying that we probably should be introducing qualifications alongside the EPA model. That's probably a whole other debate.
Well, it is, and I was in the original debates, and my view, sorry, I can't speak for anybody other than myself, was always that qualifications did always form an important part and probably should ongoing. And of course, the programs that we hold dear, which are the degree programs, all have a degree in them. So it's interesting that the government don't hold true to what they've said. But Eric, you mentioned that in terms of you don't think people should be on a programme if there isn't an EPA?
No, I mean, just to pick up on the gentleman's question, is that we were approached by the training provider who was delivering the standard as part of a Trailblazer programme. And those apprentices were about 9 months in the programme by the time that we were approved to be on the register, and we had to ramp up and start to create assessment materials, everything in a very, very short period of time. And I think which is why I do say that there needs to be that organisation in place, because as an endpoint assessment organisation, you look at that standard in a very different way than a provider does. You're responsible for bringing, you can write an assessment plan in a room and it sounds great, but you as the endpoint assessment organisation are responsible for bringing that to life. But going back to your original question, I think now, from what I understand, the IFA actively reach out to organisations to ask them to apply to be part of the register. But I think as a business, you have to know, if it's something like business administration, then you know that there's some volume, but where they are smaller niche standards, there may not be the volume to make it commercially viable.
I think everybody would agree with what sits behind your question is that is it fair on either an employer, but more particularly on an apprentice, to be on a programme where they don't know yet what and I guess, no, that doesn't seem right. But Charlotte, how close are we to getting to the point where that shouldn't happen again?
So I think there's two different questions here, and this is where it's getting muddled, is actually for an endpoint assessment organisation, getting on the register is the easy bit. It's actually after that, the hard work, the real investment, the real resource kicks in. And I think, in all honesty, it feels to me there's a number of people who thought, oh, actually, yeah, we will become the endpoint assessment for that standard, that standard, that standard. But then that true impact of what that really means is people possibly thought, actually, do I really want to develop? Have I got the time investment to develop all the assessment materials, all the infrastructure, all the staffing to actually sit behind that? So and I think what you've got is IFA are asking the first question, looking at the register and seeing that there is coverage, instead of saying, but how many are actually now really preparing to deliver the assessment for that? And I can see a lot of nods, actually, so this is clearly resonating with people. The part that I found more frustrating is when we started this was to actually give employers a clear understanding of what was available, less standards so they could navigate it, so we could understand what the progression was for people on apprentices. We now actually have more standards than we did frameworks, which, how have we ended up there? And there are some, what I believe, quite odd standards that are approved, roller coaster engineer, where there are then things that aren't approved or are taking more time to go through. So there's some actual bigger, wider questions we need to be asking ourselves. This started off being about productivity in the UK and higher quality apprenticeships, and now we're in a situation where it's gone crazy the amount of standards that are approved. There's people on that are approved to offer those, but do we know if they're really going to develop the assessments? We've got a roller coaster engineer being approved and more challenge for something like nursing associate. That just confuses me, but maybe I've just got an odd brain.
No. One of the many things that we were all confused about. But I was interested in showing you that particular question. Would you be happy if some of your employees were on a programme that didn't have a endpoint assessment?
No, we wouldn't. We wouldn't be happy at all. So when we started on the standards last year for our warehousing operative, we knew the endpoint assessor we wanted, but they were going through their sign-off. So we agreed with our training provider, who was going to deliver that programme, to use a different endpoint assessor or assessment organisation, because actually it was important for us to start the journey. It was going to be our pilot programme. We will then swap over to our appointed organisation. But I think we've also had to take a leap of faith, because for our engineering programmes, they're 3.5-year programmes, they've just moved on to standards. We are hopeful by, and I know actually the endpoint assessors are now in place, but at least 12 months into the programme that it would be. I think the challenge is it's the shorter programmes where you don't have that opportunity to be able to say, oh, it's all right, it's 3 years down the line. Yeah. And it is a real leap of faith. And everything we're doing in the apprentice world is a leap of faith at the moment. And most organisations, we have a structure, we have a business plan, a long-range plan, yet it doesn't feel the same when it comes to apprenticeships and the money that we're having to hand over to deliver it.
I think I'll just use chairman's privilege for 1 second, which is I think you raise a point, which is if UK PLC were developing the apprenticeship reforms, it wouldn't be over 3 years, it would be over 10.
Yeah.
And many of these issues have come because they have to squeeze it into a parliament and set themselves some, in some respects, some would say crazy targets. Let's move to question 3. Julie Weeks, Oasis Care and Training.
Good afternoon. Many feel that the pass rate for the new standards has been very disappointing. Are we prepared for endpoint assessment, and how can things be improved?
And well, we certainly touched on some of these issues, so again, it gives a chance to perhaps highlight the most important thing that the panel wants to see improved. But it's also difficult to know whether the new standards, what the pass rates are at the moment. Very difficult to know. But Richard's got some personal experience and mentioned it in his first response.
Yeah, so as I say, the standards are designed that people will fail. You know, if everybody passes, then it won't have worked. I don't think it's like GCSEs where the figures have been manipulated so that pass rates stay at 67.6%, because that's seen as a good figure. So I think people are hoping it'd be higher than it was. But there's all sorts of considerations with this and some perverse incentives. I think when the standards were put together, it was assumed that the standard would be a qualification and would be worth getting on its own. Actually, if you've seen, put your hand up if you've seen a standard certificate here. Anybody seen one? Yeah, they're pretty unimpressive, aren't they? It's pieces of paper. Yeah, if you look at the money in your pocket signed by the Bank of England and stamped by the Queen, and it looks pretty impressive, and you could take it somewhere, and this is backed by the Bank of England. You know, the endpoint assessment certificate is just a blank piece of paper. It doesn't really talk about who's approving you, who's putting their reputation on the line. So actually, what's the value of it? You know, and if you're doing an apprenticeship that contains, I don't know, chartered accountancy, and you've passed your chartered accountancy qualifications, you're a fully qualified accountant with letters after your name, licensed to practice. Oh, and by the way, you've got to go and do this endpoint assessment down the road on top. Why would you bother? Why would your employer want to pay 20% and have you out the business for 3 days to do that? So I think that there's all sorts of perverse incentives, so we'll have to really be careful with to make sure that success rates don't fail. I agree, there's no timely success rates being produced by the ESFA for last year because nobody knows what's happening. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be measuring them ourselves, because someone will ask us one day and we all want to be able to make sure that things are going well. So I think less people will go for endpoint assessment. I think actually what will happen is you just won't pass people through Gateway. So the success rates will be very high, but it will be a smaller section. And that'll be like A-levels, you know? People get off-roll, don't they, if they're not going to pass. So actually they have really high success rates, and I suspect we're in that kind of territory now, but it won't be the whole picture.
I suppose that from my personal perspective, it sounds a bit disappointing if where we end up is lots of people deciding not to bother with the end assessment. Yeah. But the other point I think I picked from your answer was that the qualification is and continues to be an important part of the whole apprenticeship package, and maybe we should think of a way of merging the two. It is a possible route through.
It's a bit like the current system, though, well, previous system, isn't it? So if you didn't get all your functional skills, but you passed your NVQ and your tech cert, then some apprentices didn't complete their functional skills.
True. So that's true.
It's similar, but to answer your question directly, I don't think we were ready. I think it's like I said earlier, it's a new system. I think there's some confusion between providers, some employers, particularly the smaller employers who are taking on apprentices, of what endpoint assessment actually involves. I know in our case, the apprentices didn't really know what it involves. So I go back to what I said earlier about it being really important that one, the APO is in place, but two, that the employer, the provider, and the APO are working together right from the get-go, and there are some clear materials and structure that can support the apprenticeship program from day one. The more you can have the endpoint assessment organisation involved, like going in to meet with the students beforehand, the better. Yep. I think the requirements around gateway and resits and who pays what, all of that needs to be tightened up, because I think at the moment where you have an apprentice who who has to remain with that employer until they complete their endpoint assessment. So if you've got an apprentice, for example, who's working on the apprenticeship minimum wage, then until they go through, they've done all components of their apprenticeship program, but they're on apprenticeship minimum wage until they can do their endpoint assessment. But there's not enough assessors to do that, so you're longing it out. There needs to be some real structure and standardization around the gateway and what that looks like in practice.
And I think, if it's not to miss the point, make the point too obvious, but that issue around actually the endpoint assessment is for the apprentice, really, and the employer. And if we forget that, and it all becomes part of the funding debate and how training providers can manage it, it'll be a real shame. Because to hold anybody up when they're ready for their end assessment would be a travesty, I think.
Yeah, I think agreeing that is important between, it's like a tripartite agreement, isn't it? But I think, at least within our sector, where we have apprentices that are working, say, on a TV production, that's a very fixed period of time. And the challenge that we're having at the moment is if that production, you're on a production for 12 months, it's done. There is nowhere for you to stay and you can't remain with that production to do endpoint assessment.
Yeah.
So where you have companies who, are paying into this levy, it's like, well, actually, I can't even recoup it because the system isn't working for me.
The one thing I think is pretty clear, if we haven't made that clear, the training provider will be held responsible for their pass rate, in essence. They won't be held responsible for the timely pass rate, which I think is a good thing, but they will be held responsible for their pass rates. And I don't suppose too many employers will want a whole range of people not reaching the endpoint assessment. So what's very clear is training providers and awarding organisations whose future will also depend on that will need to find a way to make sure that the pass rates are high.
There's two pieces, of what I've seen in relation to pass rates is I've seen a huge divide in actually provider behaviour here. So, some providers really got behind it, realised we are moving from a task-based delivery model to learning, where I think we will see success. They've built new curriculums, there's been an investment in upskilling their current trainers, staff, and I think we will see great success and good pass rates there. We have also, though, got a number of people who haven't, for whatever reason, busy or just a misunderstanding of how big this change is, who the amount of times I've gone in to talk about endpoint assessment is, and the answer has been, we will not even consider you unless you can give us workbooks. Workbooks is not going to get somebody and support them through endpoint assessment. And I think we are going to see that divide of the success and non-success of different providers within that in relation to that. And I think this is where Ofsted actually could play a part in helping that full understanding of that leap from task to actually learning that we are seeing a number of providers make, which will help support that success. But some are actually catching up and they are going to need some help and support to get where we need to if we are going to have the success rates.
I think providers that sort of think that they've reached the gateway, made the claim for their 20% and can leave the assessment to someone else, I think will have to learn a pretty hard lesson. So I'm sure over time that
I think there is also the responsibility, I think, for endpoint assessment organisations where we can't say our job only starts at gateway. Unless we're supporting, providing that infrastructure, making sure people are prepared by practice questions, exemplars, mock assessments, then we haven't played our part either. So it is a whole change in behaviour and ways of working that, we've all got a part to play in that if we're going to make this a success and get those success rates.
And just from an employer's perspective, do you see the pass rate as something that's important to you? And
it's extremely important.
Right.
No employer brings in an apprentice to fail.
No, sure.
And, we would never, it would have to be an exception to stop at the gateway for an individual. We would do everything in our power to get them prepped and prepared. And we celebrate every year our apprentices' successes and we bring them all together. And the last thing we'd want is to have an apprentice sitting there thinking, I can't celebrate because I haven't achieved. And that's unfair on them.
Okay.
It'll impact, I think it will impact the onboarding, the recruitment side a lot more. I mean, because we are really readjusting and rethinking the way we do that initial assessment process, because we're coming through to do our first cohort as a training provider of endpoint assessment. And I think we're definitely looking at our candidate pool beforehand, and as well as the role, and a lot more within the employer to make sure that there is that capacity to be able to deliver.
And that's why not having an endpoint assessment available at the beginning seems crazy, which comes back to that previous point. I think that the fourth question might pick some of that up in terms of the processes. It's Zoe Griffiths from Alchemy of Learning.
What are the main challenges encountered by training providers and employers to ensure compliance, student tracking, attainment and onboarding?
Yeah, and I guess that is a reinforcement of that issue, that, you know, what's the key challenge right now? It may be some of those that we've already talked about, but each of the panels, so what would you say was the main challenge for getting that process that clearly starts from the beginning right the way through to the end? Tom, from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I'm glad you said, Stuart, from a policy perspective, because I can't obviously talk from a provider or indeed from an EPAO
yes, you can.
Perspective. But I think actually the question, just to broaden out a little bit, is about also the extent to which we've got the endpoint quality assurance of this new endpoint assessment system, right? I mean, we've mentioned the acronym EQA yet on the panel, but I mean, I think it's a really important part, again, of the reforms. And, you know, I think we're all, well, certainly, you know, I'm being brutally honest, I'm not convinced, I think many of my members are not convinced that we've got the right approach to endpoint quality assurance, which would be picking up a lot of these compliance issues, coherence issues, consistency issues across the endpoint assessment network. And what I mean by that is, you know, if you think about the process of how we're inspecting schools, colleges, and work-based training providers, you know, Ofsted is in that sense, the endpoint quality assurer, and people have got views about Ofsted and whether it does its job in the right way, but nevertheless, there's one organisation doing that. We don't have multiple Ofsted organisations, and I think there is a concern about whether or not the EQA model. I mean, you could have a system still of multiple endpoint quality assurers, but we're not working towards a single quality assurance model at the moment. I mean, if you ask the different parts of the system, we've got Ofqual now that's issued, obviously, regulations around what it expects from EQA and therefore compliance around the system. The Institute for Apprenticeships hasn't yet published what its details would be, and indeed there are other players as well in the EQA market. And that ultimately, just coming back to what the whole purpose of these reforms was about, yes, UK productivity, UK PLC, but also about a world-class apprenticeship model that has got to pass the laugh test at the end of the day. You know, have we actually delivered on what we set out to achieve in 2013?
Yeah. Richard, is there?
Yeah, we had a visit from Ofsted not so long ago, and it was very difficult, really, for a number of reasons, but this was one of them. I actually found them very old school around all this, worrying about assessors and workbooks and tracking people's competence rather than their progress towards an endpoint assessment. So we found they were very behind the times in their approach, because, yeah, as you mentioned, we're all new standards, we're all about teaching and learning, not about workbooks and you know, that kind of old MVQ way of doing things. And so I wouldn't necessarily hold Ofsted up as the best example of this. On a practical level, as a training provider, these are the issues that we've found. You might be on the register as an endpoint assessment body, but that's great. But that's not half the story. You select that person off the endpoint of the register, but will they come and do an endpoint assessment for one apprentice on a Tuesday night in Huddersfield in February? And if not, what's the point in them? You know, they're no good to you if that's what you need. Also, the employer has a role in choosing the endpoint assessment body. Is the employer happy that the body that's on the register adds value to that individual's learning journey and their assessment? Are they really expert, or are they just on there as a generalist? So you've got to find the right endpoint assessment body that works with your employer, and it's the practicalities that kill it. So will they come and do the endpoint assessments where you want them, when the employer wants them? Will they charge a reasonable and sensible fee and not too far up front? And then how do you get the information off your system, where you've been teaching them and they've been putting together a portfolio of evidence, onto their system? And it's those really boring practical things that are the hardest things and that will kill it. And unless you've got a really slick way of transferring that information to the EPA up front electronically, so they've got the background to be able to conduct the EPA, you're not going to get anywhere with it. So I think it's just that physically doing a dry run through, which is what we've done, to say we're going to send you this by pressing this button and it will go to that system and work through a whole dry run, otherwise I think you'll struggle.
And I know this is not a black and white answer, but do you think that training providers will have to take a more active role in managing that whole process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some endpoint assessment bodies are very good and they know everything about it, others don't. So we've been in a position of saying to an endpoint assessment body, but you need to be doing this. Where you're putting together a panel of employers for interview, do you want us to put the panel together for you? Should we find them? Should we get them in? Because I don't think they've got the contacts or the reach to be able to do it themselves necessarily. So yeah, you've got to work in partnership, as you say, from day one. Who's going to be doing what and how? And you can't wash your hands of it because we are, like the employer, training provider, absolutely living on our reputations and want everybody to get through and pass and do well. So we will have a sort of skin in the game, I guess.
And one of the initial Richard type approaches, or certainly in the early discussions that I sat in on, the government view was that employers would take this on board and do the negotiation with the awarding organisations, manage the whole endpoint assessment. What's your view of that? Is that where the employer wants to be?
No, absolutely not. So the endpoint assessment and the training providers for us has been a challenge. So we've appointed one endpoint assessor. We have a number of colleges across the organisation, as well as training providers who come to us, and we couldn't or didn't want the hassle of having lots of different endpoint assessors depending on where you were in the country. But for us, it was also about consistency. So if we have one endpoint assessor, we can't guarantee the consistency in the colleges. That's out of our control, unless we send all of our apprentices to one location, and then we could guarantee that. But if from an endpoint assessor, we have just one, that should give us the standard. But no employer wants to take on extra work. We run an organisation, we run a business, okay, and we bring apprentices in order for them to help with our succession and our skills gap. We didn't bring apprentices in to take over the whole journey.
Thank you. Charlotte, I mean, you work with both employers directly and with training providers. What's your view about managing the whole process?
So I'm going to start with the employer provider set maybe first. So in particular sectors, we've seen a huge growth of employer providers who maybe thought actually the most easiest way to manage and support this was actually do it themselves, and I think actually some people need to be accountable that they said to a number of employers, if you become a provider, if you have your own programs that you're already offering in-house, you know what, this will be a breeze. The reality is they haven't got the infrastructure that good providers have got around tracking, compliance, quality, the whole infrastructure, and that's the part that I'm actually the most worried about. Is this has all been done by good intention by employers who have then become these providers, and I hate to fast forward, but I'm quite sure when they have their Ofsted visits, we're not necessarily going to see brilliant outcomes. Providers are there for a reason, and they add value to the system. Let providers do what they're really good at, which is delivery. Let assessment organisations do what they're really good at, assessment, and let employers kind of meet their own values and objectives they're trying to meet for their business and support them in a way so we can make this grow. I think that's the only way we can make it work.
And it was a broad question. Do you think it got somewhere towards... I think so. I was a bit worried about that question, but I think the panel have answered that very well. I guess the question that sits behind all of this is the funding thing, as always, which means, as employers, providers, and awarding organisations find the right way through, they're also going to have to find a way of making sure that the money follows the work that's being done. But in some respects, we shouldn't let that drive the picture.
There's some audience participation in them.
There is a bit of audience participation. We're going to go off piece. We'll allow one comment, but we have got some time at the end. But the roving mic, I guess you will need the roving mic. But if you take too long, you'll get me into big trouble.
I just wanted to pick up the comment about employer-provider, because we're employer-provider and work for the ambulance service, and we've always provided the education. So I think that it's not always best that there's a separate provider when you're dealing in specialist patient care that you've already delivered.
I think, you know, where there is a specialist in particular, where it works really well, where you're actually delivering some of that programme, but not taking responsibility for the whole
We deliver all of it apart from the endpoint assessment. So I think because the ambulance service with others did the Trailblazer, and we do deliver it, and you know our success rate is good. I would say that there is more difficulty around working with the compliance of Ofsted because it doesn't feel that it all comes together, and we have had a monitoring visit.
I think that's the point really that I guess we're all trying to make, which is there has to be some options for employers, absolutely. But employers at the beginning, I don't think, had the full picture and didn't realise what was required. Because some of that monitoring feels like bureaucracy, but some of it's really important. And if you get stuffed by Ofsted, is that a technical word, stuffed by Ofsted? No, I don't think it is. But anyway, if you get an Ofsted visit that doesn't work for you, the only people who really, really suffer are the apprentices on that programme.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So we've got to get it right, whether we like it or not, and that compliance. And all I think we were saying is some of the employers didn't realise what they were getting themselves into. So listen, I sat through some of those Trailblazer meetings. I can tell you they didn't get the full picture. Fifth question, which sort of touches on grounds that we've already covered. So hopefully we can cover this fairly quickly. Mr. Richard Meredith from One File.
4 types of organisations that currently exist to externally quality assure EPA. Ofqual have laid out their scheme, and as Tom rightly says, with others have yet to publish theirs. How do we avoid a 2-tier system?
Okay, 2-tier or maybe 3 or 4-tier, but a different tiered system. Tom, maybe you...
The short answer is we need a single quality assurance framework for the apprenticeship system and endpoint assessment in particular. There can be multiple players, just like there are, you know, multiple examination centres that the DVLA has for driving instruction. You can take your choice, but the point is they're all working to a Department of Transport approved single standard, and for, you know, you and I as lay people, we call it the highway code. So that's what you're being assessed against, you know, when you go for your driving test, and that's for me what we clearly need to move towards with endpoint quality assurance, because the danger otherwise, and you know, I agree with Sir Jerry on this in terms of what he said to the select committee. I mean, the whole nature of these reforms does actually hinge around the extent to which employers at the end of the day have confidence in the quality assurance system, and that includes the quality of the training provision, the quality of the endpoint assessment, and ultimately the quality of the end product, which is a proficient and competent apprentice, which is not only qualified to work in that particular occupation in that particular firm, but is qualified to work in the industry. And that's another big difference, I think, that we shouldn't lose sight of about these reforms. It is about ensuring people are equipped with portable, transferable, industry-relevant skills going forward, and not just being trained for a whole series of tasks around a particular occupation or a particular employer. And I think the comments made earlier about the you know, the north of, 700 standards, I think the IFA's penciled in, potentially, that will be signed off over the next sort of 18 months or so. I mean, that's already twice the number in Germany, 331, there's 256 in Switzerland last time I checked. I think that should be a worry for all of us in the system that are really concerned about, you know, this nature of world-class apprenticeships, that we don't, by default, end up with a very, very granulated, occupationally specific work-based training program, as opposed to the vision around apprenticeships, which is equipping people for the 21st century challenges that we face.
And not wishing to be a spokesman for the government, but certainly at the beginning there was all this drive for flexibility. there has to be a balance between some sort of standardisation and that flexibility that we've currently got. I think most people accept we haven't got it quite right. Very quickly, though, Tom, the Ofqual put out a big document. I got through pages 5 to 7, but not much further. In what words of one, do you think it's a good structure that they've set out?
Well, I think it's important to to understand where Ofqual is really coming from here. I mean, it's all about, for them, public confidence in our qualifications and assessment system. So, of course, as the organisation that Parliament has empowered to police what public confidence should mean in practice, obviously they've taken the EQA challenge and they've looked at this and they've come up with a series of rules. And I think the other thing about Ofqual, which perhaps most people don't always appreciate, particularly if you're not regulated by them, is that they have real teeth. My members can be fined serious amounts of money if they fall foul of the the conditions of recognition which Ofqual and indeed the other regulators across the UK put in place. And potentially the system we're moving towards is, 48 of my members currently that are awarding organisations are on the EPAO register. Just as it so happens, actually, they cover the majority of standards, upwards of about 65% of the current standards. That will change, of course, as more standards come on stream. So that is already creating, a two-tier model. It's here already. I think the challenge is, are we moving to a 3, 4, 5 multi-tiered model, which is why we've got to, I think, get a grip of this notion of a single quality assurance framework for EQA.
Charlotte, you probably deal with a number of different types of organisations that are trying to establish EQA. What's your view of that?
Yeah, so we're approved for 26 standards. I currently have 5 different EQA organisations that we're working with, and the good intention is there with all, but have different terminology, different policies, different processes, different way of monitoring us. I've in particular got one of our EQA organisations that base it on volume and sampling. So I will have them in our organisation for 2 weeks every 3 months carrying out quality assurance, which just is that remarking or is that actually quality assurance? And so I think there's been quite a lot of discussion actually with our IFA, and they are saying they are committed to making sure there is standardisation of approach across those EQA organisations. That's yet to be seen. My way of looking at it is, could you imagine if we were in a situation where we said, instead of just having Ofsted providers, you are actually going to have different types of organisations all coming into your organisation with different views, different opinions? I don't think that would necessarily drive up quality.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think nobody likes Ofsted. That's not true. If you got grade 1, I suppose you like Ofsted. But you know what I mean? But we'd all accept it probably helpful to have a single organisation. We're all likely to improve, but it's sort of helpful that there's a single standard that we all work to. We can interpret differently. And I guess, I don't know, with employers, are you lost in all of this? Do you even read this stuff that comes out?
We don't tend to read too much of it, let's be honest. I have seen the document, the Ofqual document. I have nothing else to compare it to, so therefore I have no idea whether it's good, bad or indifferent. But I was just sat here thinking that as an organisation, we make soft drinks, we have quality standards, they are the same across the world, so why can't it just be that simple, in the world of education?
I think we'd all agree with you, and as I say, in the early days, and when I worked for AALP, and AALP I guess still do, are pushing for some flexibilities. There are some flexibilities which are unhelpful. I think this is probably one pushed too far, but I don't know whether that would be your...
If only there was just Ofsted. So you've got QAA coming in doing inspections, awarding body inspections. You look at any government programme and it's filled with madness and acronyms, so I think you just have to take that as read. Yeah, it's a cost, it's a burden. I wouldn't read it because you won't get anything from it, and anybody who does read it, you look at the functional skills madness of EPA, yeah? Welsh essential skills, allowed or not allowed? Allowed. Scottish core skills, allowed? Not allowed. Polish English, allowed or not allowed? Allowed. Canadian English, allowed or not allowed? Not allowed. Yeah, you can spend your life looking at the madness of all of the intricacies. You just have to assume that generally those kind of things are attacks and kind of work.
Yeah, and I guess the argument there would be it's always going to be madness, but if it's one single madness, it gives you a half a chance of working your way through it. Any views on that from your perspective, both provider and...
We had, with my EPAO hat on, we had, there was no EQA when we applied to go on the register. We were then contacted by one when we were about to start delivering our first cohort of EPAs, which made us really nervous because we're like, we've had 3 months to get this together, and if you're coming with more compliance. But they were actually really helpful, to be fair, and I think it was really useful having them there and going through that process, having them kind of quality check what we were doing, quality checking our materials, so it made it a lot easier to build on that. I think where you haven't got an EQA in place and some standards don't have that, although from what I understand, the IFA take that default position and then subcontract it out to open awards, I think. It can become a little bit difficult, I think, and particularly given that this is supposed to be the testing, the rigor, but those who are delivering that potentially haven't gone through that rigor with an EQA. So.
Yeah. And to be fair, just to wrap that sort of question up before we open it up, I was certainly at the initial Trailblazer discussions when employers genuinely came and many of them just didn't feel confident that the qualifications that were within the apprenticeship were real and they felt part of it. So this was an attempt to get involved. I guess we're on the low slopes of getting somewhere where we all feel confident of that. So I think there were good intentions, as you mentioned, even from the government in that respect. I think it's probably time to open it up to the floor. Again, just to reiterate, if you could keep your questions fairly short, or even if you're making a point, if you say who you are and where you come from, that would be really helpful. There's a lady there.
Hi, thank you very much. My name's Laura Beswick. I'm from BPP. We're a training provider. I was just wondering, Sharon, as an employer, do you make your learners sit both the endpoint assessment parts at the same time, or do you split them out?
So we haven't had anyone going through the endpoint assessment at this particular point in time. That will come November for us. And so we will go with, on this occasion, whatever we're advised to do. So it's unfortunate they're our pilot group going through. So until that happens, we can't take control. And we are an organisation that does like to control what happens, but we're operating in someone else's space. So we're giving them the control. If it doesn't work for us, we will absolutely take the control and go, what could have been done better? And how can we ensure going forward that if it goes wrong, it doesn't happen again for us?
Because I think our concern is they'll sit one element and then not do the second part, and how do we ensure that they do both bits?
Yeah. And for us, you know, we would want them to do both bits. Some of them are already on permanent contracts with us, so it's in their interest to do both bits because they are with us. Those who are on fixed-term contracts with us are looking for the opportunity to remain permanently with us. So again, it's in their interest.
Yeah, so you link it, the passing, to them being able to progress. That's excellent. Okay, thank you.
Charlotte, I just wondered if, with your experience of endpoint assessments, is that becoming an issue? So doing elements of the endpoint assessment or having to schedule them all in?
So I can talk about the approach we've made is we actually work with the employer to come up with a delivery model that works best for them and their organisation. So we have some where they prefer cohort delivery, some where they want the planning meeting, the knowledge test on the same day, others where practical observation and professional discussion. So it's really about working with the employer, and then as showing as an endpoint assessment organisation, we can be flexible for it to be an addition to the programme rather than actually stipulating it. The kind of mantra we've got is it's only if it's a rule in the plan we have to stick to it, but outside of that, the only way we're going to make this work is offering that flexibility to actually hear what works for the employer rather than actually demanding what's best for us.
Okay. Is there another question in the front along here?
I'm Srila Banerjee from a Life Skills Network. I'm completely out of the sector, so everything that I'm hearing is new information. It just occurs to me that an enormous amount of the problems being encountered are administrative problems, and I just wondered whether the sector as a whole has considered blockchain technology.
Richard.
Portfolios, I think, yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, not that any experts on blockchain, but I think the principle of having everything online available to all the elements, I think has sort of come through. How we do that, I would have to say this sector is probably not at the forefront of IT, and mainly because we've had to cope with some pretty clunky regulation. But I do think, without, to say, the answer to all of this is the blockchain, there is an important point to be made that we do have to use the technologies that are available to make sure that we're managing that whole process. But I'll welcome any comments from the panel.
I'd be just interested to point out that actually the compliance part of it, the organisational chain, if you like, would also be updated at the same time.
Yeah, okay. Any views from the panel?
I think it's a bit like working with the government is a bit like working with a startup that's taken its product to market too soon. There's no real plan in place. There's the finance plan's not fully worked out. The product's not completely finished. And, there's a lot of revision in making it up. Not making it up, that's unfair. That's it, that back. But it's constant. So the idea, blockchain, it could work if even the basic plan and kind of structures were there and there was some real, it's not as structured as it needs to be, in my opinion. I think it needs, anyway, I'll just be quiet because I'm being recorded.
And it is a wider issue in that you could talk about blockchain, but any long-term investment in systems or in sales processes or in internal systems are very difficult to make because something's going to change. The one thing you'll be sure of, something will change next week. And that is part of the problem of why the investment doesn't happen. But I don't think it's something we should ignore. John, I think you were next in terms of the question.
Bearing in mind we're dealing with taxpayers' money, however it's raised, can we justify that the endpoint assessment costs at least 10 times more than the previous certification? And are we getting 10 times better apprentices? If not, how do we justify this expenditure to the taxpayers?
Is that a policy question, do you think, Tom?
Yeah, well, when you say taxpayers, employers, obviously large employers over a certain threshold, they're taxpayers, they're paying into the apprenticeship levy. I think there's a healthy debate going on, not yet, I think, finalised about the extent to which some of these infrastructure costs that we've talked about, like endpoint quality assurance, should be top sliced and actually paid for centrally, essentially out of the levy. I think, ALP's looked at that. But, in the end, it comes back to what outcome are we trying to achieve as a country, and we want a world-class apprenticeship system that we're proud of. And frankly, I don't think costs should necessarily come into it, other than the cost that it should require to deliver that world-class system. And I think one of the challenges at the moment with the review of the funding bands, for example, which whilst one or two that have been leaked to the press suggest that the funding band has gone up, on the whole most of the funding bands are coming down, and at the same time it's just the government that's saying it's concerned about a race to the bottom in relation to skills and productivity. So there's a lot of mismatch out there at the moment in terms of ambition and actual reality on the ground. So I think rather than get into a sort of taxpayers alliance argument about whether or not the system is affordable, I think we've just got to get the system working effectively, with employers ultimately having confidence in this new approach.
And I think some of it comes back to having a plan. And the original apprenticeship reform plan had a line in there about investment in both providers, investment in awarding organisations and investment in the system. I don't think any of that investment's been made. So I think that's a very valid point. Let's go to a question in the middle there. Hope I didn't miss anybody there.
Hi, my name's Tim Beasley. I work for a large employer called Electric Components, and we're a levy payer, but we're not a training provider, which I was glad to hear when I was taken on as the apprenticeship program manager. It's clear to hear that there's a lot of things being that's not very clear. I think the lady there summed it up really well, that it feels like a bit of a start-up business still going on. Is there any pushback being made to the government to extend the deadline then, so that before we actually start losing money from our levy pots because of all this uncertainty that's going on?
I'll respond immediately. I think there has been quite a lot of pushback, both from employers and training providers. So for example, the standards were all due to be in by 2018. That's been pushed back. The original plan was to spend the money in 12 months. It's now 24 months. Will there be any other changes? Who knows? Don't know whether you're involved in the employer debate about and where is it likely to be a pushback on?
We're not involved in the employer debate, but I do remember when they said it was going to be 12 months thinking, we haven't even got a structure or a plan in place. How on earth are we going to spend the money? But actually 24 months is looming pretty quickly. Yeah. And that's a big concern in terms of we've always said we will not spend all of our levy. We've always known that, and that's a business decision. But we also don't want to lose an awful lot of it at the same time. But it is going to be a real challenge, because we don't just want to do apprentices for the sake of spending the money. We want to do good quality apprentices and deliver good quality apprenticeship programs. But yeah, someone somewhere is going to be soon saying to me, how much are we about to lose if we don't hit that 24-month deadline?
Yeah, I was just thinking, if you've got an apprenticeship program already set up and it's running, the chances are you're already ahead of your payments, so you've probably got a bit more breathing room. But there's companies out there like ourselves that are just setting up now and about to start running, but we've then got 15, 16 months worth of payments to try and spend at the same time. So and
that definitely will be a challenge. And I've been on to, I still call it the DAS account, it's whatever it's called these days, and they have the projections for us, and the projections are still quite frightening, because it means I have to do an awful lot more internally, and we are about to launch our internal offerings, because most of the apprentices we have currently are new starts into our business. But I have to do something internally, because otherwise the spend will catch up quite quickly.
I better move on, because we're just drifting off the EPA, and there might be one or two questions, but I think there's a real issue for many employers who cannot spend their money now. I mean, literally, otherwise, because if you start to spend it, enough for apprentices, you'll be overspending in year 2 and 3. This gentleman there, sorry, with the yellow tie.
Acronyms not very good for dyspraxic and dyslexic people, but MAD kind of sounds like mutually assured destruction in terms of policy, but it's not very good going forward. And of course, my question to the panel is, how do you be inclusive in terms of neurodiversity in the endpoint assessment? You've got people autistic, dyspraxic and dyslexic. How do you assure that quality and the outcomes that are going forward are inclusive? That's a very important question.
This is actually one of my things that fits into that clarity box. So in the majority of assessment plans at the moment, when you're talking about what is deemed as reasonable adjustments, it says refer to your endpoint assessment organisation, and a number of different people I've spoken to have said actually they've spoken to the endpoint assessment organisation, and the rules that are there are 25% extra time, which actually for the difficulties, challenges we're dealing with isn't right. So there's a piece of work that I've kicked off working with an organisation called CogniAssist, which is trying to say what are those difficulties, and then actually how can we make sure that is not just supported but through the delivery, but also then we can make sure is supported through the endpoint assessment to make those relevant changes. And we're trying to get some momentum behind this so we can go to government and say, actually, can we then have consistency and appropriate reasonable adjustments for the difficult and disabilities that we may need to consider for endpoint assessment, and I don't think trailblazer groups thought of the diversity of apprentices, and I think this isn't beginning to be an issue, and I think we need to do something about it. So if you want to chat afterwards, I can share in further detail some of that work we're doing.
I think Sharon's comment earlier about, say, a fixed standard globally should be the point for an end assessment. I mean, I'm familiar with manufacturing. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm a teacher, and I'm an assessor. But I'm also autistic, dyspraxic, and I'm dyslexic. And I think that, like an ISO 9001 standard, just Sharon will be familiar with, it's a global standard set through BSR. You can refer to that anywhere in the world and work through that program. You can also have a fixed assessment, and I think that's where we should be at. And consulting organizations like Dyspraxia Foundation, Dyslexia Foundation, Autism, and really having those roundtable discussions going forward, because I don't believe that you'll have the best possible outcomes if you don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's it's very hard to disagree with you, but in the same way that I think most of the responses have been we're just not prepared, then clearly we're not prepared for those who need additional help and support. I'm absolutely sure. I'm sure we will do whatever we can, but we're just not prepared for that. And that's something I think we'll take away. And I think that's a general point, that there are a number of things that have been raised today that I hope, with the number of people who are here and the sort of range of organisations, it gives a voice to some of those concerns, and we'll make sure that that's captured when we take away. I think I've got one last question, if there is one. And there's a lady towards the front here. So it'll have to be, unfortunately, the last question, I think.
Hello, I'm Julie Smith from Enable Assessment, and my question is, how important is it that the assessor is qualified as an assessor as opposed to occupationally qualified?
Well, let's start with Charlotte. I guess you've got plenty of them.
So I suppose there is that question, actually, what is a qualified assessor? Because endpoint assessment is actually very, very new. So we've got a whole bunch of people who have Carver, D32, D33, A1, V1 qualifications, and I think that's a really sound base. But we are in a new world, so from our perspective, there is still a lot of upskilling that needs to take place. Some people may not have had that direct contact with apprentices for a period of time, so how do we make sure they're able to coach and get the most out of those apprentices? Grading, reporting, all new things. So I think even if people have been assessors, there's a big upskill program that needs to take place, and we've done some work to develop an online course which we've made available free. So if people want to have a look at that, it's free to anybody to utilise. In relation to the occupational competence, I think it's relevant and appropriate occupational competence. One of the challenges at the moment, which I think is becoming well documented, is when we think of health. So for a level 2 healthcare worker, the assessor is required to have a nursing PIN that is still available. It's an area we're really struggling with. So I think it's about relevant and appropriate occupational competence rather than kind of making up rules that aren't necessarily going to add value and support that journey of that apprentice.
From a policy perspective, do you think a wider...
Well, I think it's a really pertinent question, and the corollary to that, of course, is do we have enough assessors in the system to deliver the kind of volume that Richard was talking about earlier? And I guess the challenge around should assessors be formally qualified or not, and I see that the Assessors Guild is exhibiting here, and there are obviously initiatives that are flowering up around that sort of concept. Frankly, if it acts though as a barrier to getting the volume of assessors that we'll need in the system to carry out the EPAs, then maybe that making it a requirement is not probably the direction we should go in. But I think really the bigger challenge is clearly as a new and developing market, we need to ensure that pool of talent, of assessment talent along the lines that Charlotte was talking about, is actually available, whilst recognising that a lot of EPAOs, of course, are already investing heavily in their endpoint assessors, and indeed are employing them directly as opposed to necessarily in the old MVQ days when it was all about sort of freelancers. So I think it will be, again, a bit of a multi-speed model that will develop there.
And I guess from an employer perspective, I'd expect a blend of both, because I would not want an assessor coming into our organisation who had worked in a totally different environment. How could they assess and understand what our people are delivering, our apprentices are delivering, and be able to say that they have the skills, the knowledge, behaviours, and are competent to move on if they actually don't have a Scooby-Doo about the industry?
I think it's true to say that one of your 4 Cs, I think it's one of your 4 Cs, but the clarity about when is someone independent and not independent needs to be worked through. Like in the old days, most training providers did it, but it was overseen and assured. Now, I think that could be tightened up, but inevitably there's a lot of people out there, there's a lot of organisations that are working with their employers, so organising and pulling together the assessment whilst somebody else is assuring it, I think is a concept we sort of knew well before, and I think may need to be revisited. I'm really conscious of your time and in terms of the next panel as well, and want to give you as much time as you can to network, which is sometimes the most important thing. But before we do that, before we end, perhaps I could ask you to say a huge thank you to our panel who've given up their time today and gave some great answers. Thank you.